Hello everyone, Trophy Wine Hunter. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm so excited to bring you the 1995 Chateau Margaux. So let's talk about Chateau Margaux. Lots of history. So the Chateau Margaux started in the 12th century. The property was actually known as Le Morte de Margaux, which was reserved for the use of royalty. But the actual name corresponded to another vineyard site, and in fact originally the estate was not used to grow wine but actually grain. So there was successive owners of Le Morte de Margaux, and they were all of noble birth, and then the Lestonec family took over the estate somewhere between the late 1500s, 1572 to 1582, somewhere around there, and restructured the property to grow wine instead of grain. The next owners of Chateau Margaux, the Delude family, developed the vineyard to its present day in about the 1600s. And at the end of the 17th century, the Chateau Margaux was about 256 hectares, which is about what it is now. Only 1/3 is used for grapes or grape production or wine production. The rest is just parkland, greenery, and trees. They were taken over at the French Revolution, and then thereafter had a really bad state of dilapidation, and that created quite a depression in terms of the actual winery itself. And in 1810, there was a new owner called Marquis de la Colonilla who reinvigorated the estate, and he hired a architect called Louis Combe, who made the present day chateau. And so Chateau Margaux, there has a second wine called Pavilion Rouge de Margaux, and the first label of that was in 1906, although they did produce a second wine off and on since the 17th century. One of the reasons they did was the quality of the wines that were being produced in that period of time were not of first growth quality. So they tried to earmark that or tell the consumers that this was not first growth quality by marking it as second wine. So they came up with Pavilion Rouge de Chateau Margaux, which debuted in 1906. And prior to that, they did produce a second wine, but they just labeled it second wine or second vin. And again, the first time they labeled it, the second vin, as Pavilion Rouge de Margaux was 1906. The winery also introduced bottling of the Chateau Margaux itself in 1924, but they had to stop it in 1949 because of just cost involved and the depression. Then in 1934, the Ginestet family began purchasing shares in Chateau Margaux, and they bought all of the shares in Chateau Margaux by 1949. During that period, they improved and increased the vineyard and brought it back to the original holding site of the 1855 classification system, which is about 75 to 80 hectares. Unfortunately, they were forced to sell Chateau Margaux in 1977 to Mentzelopoulos family, Andre Mentzelopoulos, and that was due to the debt. And in that time, it was not that, they were having a hard time. Chateau Margaux and a lot of Bordeaux wineries were having a really hard time selling their wines. And that's only about 40 years ago. So this astronomical increase in prices really happened in the last little while. And it is possible that wines will go back down to that level sometime. But at that time, it was sold for like $16 million US dollars. So it wasn't that expensive a winery at that time. After his death in 1980, his daughter Corinne took over running Chateau Margaux. And she was assisted by many other famous Bordeaux enologists, Emile Pinaud and Philippe Barre, and they led, helped out with that to renovate the whole estate. They renovated the whole estate. They replanted everything in 1982. In 1983, Paul Pontallier was brought on as part of the team at Chateau Margaux, and he was at that time only 27 years, but spent the next 30 years at Chateau Margaux serving as the director of Chateau Margaux. And he was really instrumental in taking them to the next level. He was instrumental in leading them in green harvesting and reducing yields. At that time, Chateau Margaux was producing like 20,000 cases a year, and now they're down to about 12,000 cases, which means really they're using less non-ripe vines and being much more selective in terms of what vines or grapes go into their first wine. In 2009, which happened to be a spectacular vintage for Margaux and also Bordeaux in general, they added gravity-fed reception area and new vats. And this whole idea, I don't know a lot about winemaking, but it seems that the less intervention, the minimalist effect on grapes in terms of the whole winemaking process, the better. And gravity fermentation seems to work better, or most people feel that it is better in terms of producing better wines. He was never a great fan of optical sorting. They do a little bit of it, but they prefer to have employees, about 300 people who work the harvest, sort in teams. I'll talk a little bit about 2015 vintage because it was an important vintage. I actually am not drinking it this time, but I do have it. I'm proud to say that I did buy it. I was really fortunate to buy it on Pernod. The 2015 vintage was the last vintage of Paul Pelletier because he passed away in 2016. So they celebrate that with a special black label, which they almost never do. They always have this label for all vintages. So that was a very special vintage, and it's a very collectible vintage. It was also probably one of the best vintages ever of Chateau Margaux. That's kind of what they think. Of course, it still has to have the history, but people believe it's going to be one of the top vintages ever of Chateau Margaux. Paul Pelletier was replaced by Philippe Basco, who formerly worked for the winery, but then went off to, I think, some of their associate wineries, like Napanuk, I think in America, and came back. And I was fortunate enough, I visited the winery in 2017 and was fortunate enough to meet him. We had lunch and tried some wines with him. I still remember that we were, as our group, was invited and hosted there. The first thing they did is they showed us a self-playing piano from Napoleon's times. That was really neat and added to the specialness of the occasion. As I said before, the winery is about 240 hectares, but only a third is planted with actual grapes. That's about 82 hectares. And of that, it's planted 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, 20% Merlot, 3% Petit Verdot, and 2% Cabernet Franc. On average, the vines are kept about 35 years, although they do have some vines that are over 80 years of age. The old vine Merlot and Petit Verdot are close to 60 years of age. And I guess the good thing with this old vines, why we talk about old vines is normally because they're old vines, they have roots that go deeper, so therefore they're going to reach different types of soil, which is going to be more complex wines. The bad thing about old vines is that their yield is very low. As they get older, the yield gets lower and lower. So you need some newer vines to give you that yield in terms of the actual grapes being used. So they have both wood and stainless steel, and now they have 24 wood and 95 stainless steel tanks. And so and they have from varying sizes. So that's really quite a bit. Most wineries have probably 40 or 50. That's already very good. If you're talking about 80, that's exceptional. This is almost like over 100 different vats to which you can ferment. And again, the great thing is that you can ferment different types of grape. You can ferment different grape varietals separately. You can ferment different plots and actually separate each one and figure out which one is good you're going to work out very well in the blend. Chateau Margaux is dealing with global warming. One of the things they're doing is that each year they are changing between 1 to 1.5% of the vines and replanting them so that they are now moving away from southwest exposure, which is traditionally the best exposure for ripeness, to northeast exposure, which provides a little bit cooler, shadier conditions because with global warming, the sun is getting hotter and the temperature is getting hotter. So it's actually not conducive for certain grape varietals like Merlot. So they're trying to change that up a little bit. One of the other unique things which we saw at the winery is that they have their own cooperage. And again, that's just controlling your own bottling. One of the first wineries to do that, and now having their own cooperage really helps them because it's a quality control thing. They can figure out what type of oak goes well. They can actually get it the way they want it and do their own experimentation. Most vintages of Chateau Margaux are fairly standard in terms of they always use 100% new oak, and it's aged between 18 and 24 months, generally on the longer part of that period. Let's talk a little bit about some of their authenticity or authentication of bottles. It's a big problem with high-end trophy wines, having fake bottles. Since 2011, they have this kind of code on the bottle where you can compare bottles. I personally don't like that very much. It's really hard to actually compare. But the only nice thing is when you scan it in, it does give you the right vintage. So if you can't even get the right vintage, then it's a real big problem. But the actual looking at the bubbles is actually very difficult to do, in my opinion. But they've had kind of authentication things in their bottles since 1989. And they obviously don't tell people what it is, but they've done little things in each year. So when I read online for 1989, they had something etched on the bottom of the bottle, and actually a mistake actually on the spelling of mise en bouteille. They put an X on it in the 1989 vintage. So for different vintages, they have different techniques to authenticate the bottles. And I don't think I've discovered the one for 1995 yet, but I don't have any doubt that this is a authentic bottle. So I'm not too worried about that. But I think if you ever had some questions about the authenticity of a bottle, again, prior to 2000, after 2011, you can just authenticate the bottle easily by the QR code or the actual ID. Between 1989 and 2011, you can actually contact the winery and probably they can authenticate it various ways. Let's talk about the 1995 vintage. That's the blend. The blend was 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, 17% Merlot, 5% Petit Verdot, and 3% Cabernet Franc. It was aged 24 months in 100% new oak. When I first started drinking Bordeaux, I always thought the general rule is the ones that end with 0 and 5 are actually very good vintage. And as a general rule, that's not a bad rule. Like starting from the 1990 vintage, 95, 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020. Generally speaking, that's correct. So I always thought 1995 was a great vintage. 1995 was a good vintage. It was very hot. But the more, and I'm not sure how critics rank it, but I think in those days when it first came out, everyone thought 1995 was going to be a spectacular vintage. I think after now so many years, 25, 30 years, people are beginning to realize that the 1996 and the 1998 vintages are also exceptional vintages. Personally, I enjoy the 1996 and the 1998 vintage a little bit more. There's a personal reason for 1998 for me, but the 1996, if you give me a choice, I think it actually drinks better than the 1995 vintage just because it's got more fruit. 1995 to me has always been a very tannic vintage and a very backward, austere vintage. Great tannins, good fruit, but somehow the tannins overpower the fruit, whereas I find the 1996 vintage a little bit more balanced and much more warm in terms of much more enjoyable wine. And same thing with 1998 and even 1999, a little bit weaker vintage, but still really drinkable. 1995, the tannins definitely will last for like 50 years. The only question is whether the fruit will survive it. And there are a lot of great Pomerol or right bank wines in that year. but on the left bank, it can be a little bit austere and tannic. So that's kind of my general point of view of these wines. But let's have this wine. I just came back from dinner. We put it in the decanter, and I had it over a course of 2 to 2.5 hours. The rest of it was in the bottle, so this part of it has not been in a decanter, but it has been aired out in bottle. I guess you could call it slow walks for the last 2.5, 3 hours. When it first came out, it was tannic, but as it opened up during the night, during dinner with food, it was much more smooth, and you got some chocolatey notes. It was kind of more medium bodied, and a lot of red fruit. And a little bit of herbaceousness. That's kind of my notes from the dinner. So now I'm back home without food, and it's been well aired. It hasn't been in a decanter, but let's check it out now. I almost get a little bit of mintiness actually now on the nose, but very floral, fresh cut flowers, roses, that type of a red fruit. So on the aroma, it's like spectacular and very much Margaux-esque in my opinion. On the taste, when it first came out, I found it was very tannic. Now after a lot of aeration, it's much softer. It's got a lot of red fruit. The tannins are not as pronounced. It does have a slight herbaceousness to it. And then it's got kind of a tanginess to it. So I would say like raspberries, but not like fresh raspberries, almost like dried raspberries and dried strawberries on the note of it. It's got a almost iron type finish to it. A little bit of graphite even in terms of the aftertaste, and a little bit of herbaceousness, like almost like Italian herbs, that type of herbaceousness with a little bit of greenness in it, but almost like a Cabernet Franc in the mix. There's definitely some iron in this, and the aftertaste is slightly like Asian spice medicinal, like an Asian medicine shop. It's got some exotic tones to this. I wouldn't say it's overly powerful right now. I think it's medium body. It's got good acidity. The tannins are actually quite resolved at this point. So I think this is really in its drinking window right now. I think it can go a little bit longer, maybe 5 years, maybe 8 at the most, but it's really drinking very nicely now, and I don't think it's gonna get much better. This is an excellent wine, as all Margaux are. I've had better examples of Margaux, but it's still very nice. It has the prototypical characteristics of Margaux, but I think it's getting to, I think with this vintage, and this is a really good example of 1995, a lot of 1995s, the balance is the issue, and right now the tannins are resolved quite nicely, and you've got that fruit. So I think it's just at the end of its plateau right now, so you should really be drinking this up. Again, a beautiful example of Margaux, probably not prototypical, like classic example of Margaux, but still very nice. And again, has that aroma, very floral aroma, red fruit, and then on the taste, again, the silkiness at the end, almost like a chocolatey, a little bit of iron, and a little bit of a herbaceousness. So my rating of this wine is 93 points. Great wine. Really happy I got to open this, and hope you've enjoyed this review. Until next time, happy drinking.